For God is truly good and worthy to be praised. As we give God glory and honor this morning, turn with me, if you will, to the Gospel of Luke, the 19th chapter. Luke's Gospel, the 19th chapter. Beginning at the 36th verse and ending at the 40th verse. On this Passion Sunday or Palm Sunday, depending on what year in the Christian calendar it's recognized. The Gospel of Luke, the 19th chapter, beginning at the 36th verse and ending at the 40th. When you have it, say, I got it. If you don't know where to look, say, help me, Jesus. All right, praise the Lord. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All right. Chapter 19, verses 36 through 40. Where it says these words. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, order your disciples to stop. He answered, I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. Just for the next few moments, I want to tell you that Jesus kept the appointment. Jesus kept the appointment. My brothers and my sisters, in these polarizing and difficult times in which we live, where this nation, like many others, is divided upon and identified across lines of partisan politics, nationalist rhetoric, and nativism, where we hear slogans and sayings like keep or make America great again. Where we find ourselves, depending what side you are on, being called liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, far left, far right, progressive or moderate. All of these labels remind us that nothing new is happening that we've never seen before. These same difficult conversations were had in the 50s and the 60s when people were divided, and we saw it playing out on the national news. Marching in Selma, Alabama, struggling and fighting in Greensboro, North Carolina, to be able to sit at a lunch counter. Where in the conservative South there were those who protested for the right and the equality of all people, while there were also those who sought through legislation to oppress and subjugate other people. Well, even here in the liberal North, where there were those who felt that they needed to join in the struggle of what was going on in order for all people across this land and across this world to live in love and charity with equality and equity for all people, yet we found ourselves fighting amongst ourselves in order for others to be seen and to be heard. right here in this county of Essex in 1967, when folk had got tired and had enough. There was a rebellion that took place, and people all across Newark began to justify and to raise their voices against the atrocities and public policies that had gone on for far too long, where there were those who found themselves being victimized and brutalized just because of where they were from and where they lived. Where that great poet Amira Baraka said, the revolution will not be televised. That meant that when the transition and the changes come, there would not be any kind of advance notice. Folk would not know what was going on, but they would know that a change happened. My brothers and my sisters, we sit in the very same times. The times where we continue to see before our eyes our children being undereducated. They don't invest in the schools, yet the government continues to invest in the prisons. We find healthcare being a central focus of many of the campaigns going on, yet the costs continue to skyrocket. And they continue to invest in the military might of a nation and say that they cannot pay for Medicare for all. It seems like things are so out of whack and out of joint that the people are not being heard, nor are their fears being addressed, and we wonder why, what's going on, why it's happening, and who will listen when things reach their breaking point. That's why, my brothers and my sisters, this Sunday morning, as we recognize the passion of Jesus, I want us to understand and to know that the oppressed are heard by God, and God addresses all of our fears. That those who find themselves being victimized and pushed aside and forgotten by society, that God hears our calls and our cries and recognizes our needs. That's why I'm glad this morning that Jesus kept the appointment. And so the significance of today in the life of the church is one that represents the culmination of what is called the passion of Jesus Christ. In Christianity, passion, coming from the Latin word that means suffering or enduring, is the short final period in the life of Jesus, beginning with his triumphant entry into Jerusalem and ending with his crucifixion and death on Good Friday. It's significant because it opens up the week where we remember the life, the death, and look to the witnessing of the resurrection from the dead that we profess by faith, that it's in this moment that we recognize today that Jesus began his journey to the scheduled appointment with the death on the cross that would lead to our redemption. But it also reminds us and calls us to recognize that this suffering and death is a path that we all must take. It is in this that we are reminded of what Jesus did for us despite the cheers and the celebrations we partake in. In Christian worship, we must confront the eventuality of death with the hope of the resurrection. So today, from this text, I want us to understand and come to know that the journey of Jesus we celebrate today is a death march. It's a march that we all have to take. The Apostle Paul put it this way in Galatians chapter 2, 19b through 20, when he says, I have been crucified with Christ. And it is no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. It's through this death march, which we all must take with Jesus, that allows us to also live with him. And so in our text, Jesus has instructed his disciples to go into a village at the place called the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is a mountain ridge that is east and adjacent to Jerusalem, the old city, the place that they identified as the seat and the residence of God's power and God's presence. That this mountain is named the Mount of Olives because it's covered up and down. It slopes with olive branches and olive trees that overflow. And the road and the path is not clear because the very olives continue to hang over and they grow wild. And he instructs them to go into the city and get a colt and bring it back and then put their clothes on top of it. And Jesus begins this ride down the mountain. And it says in the text that the crowd began to shout and to celebrate, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord." Now you must understand that the cheering of the crowd in designation of Jesus as King or Messiah, the one anointed by God that they recognized and looked for to deliver God's people, was a dangerous title for him to have. It was a dangerous title for him to have because the Romans had occupied their land for so long, and Caesar had taxed and burdened them down, and even put someone who was not of the lineage of David named Herod in place to rule over them, who also subjugated their people to violence and oppression. It was Herod and his father who had become famous, not just for building the temple in Jerusalem and expanding it, but he had also become famous because of what he did to his political enemies. It was Herod who crucified anybody that looked like they could challenge his sovereign authority. It was Herod who would designate those that would be called enemies of the people. It was Herod who would tweet at the midnight hour and early in the morning and call those who had challenged his authority in spite of the laws of the land. He would call them traitors and say they were un-American, and he would be the one that would villainize and marginalize those who did not agree with him by talking about the walls that would be built. I'm talking about Herod. See, the spirit of Herod runs rampant today. It's Herod who wants to build a wall to separate and divide. It's Herod who wants to enjoy the fruit of his labors and his bad business dealings and never release his taxes nor be subject to any checks and balances. It's Herod that likes to destroy and separate families. And it's Herod who likes to imprison those who would challenge his authority by getting his followers to chant, lock them up. I'm talking about Herod. And anybody who challenged the authority would be killed. And in the text, to designate and to cry out that Jesus was a king would summon the authorities into their area. Imagine, if you will, if we had the nerve to designate someone else as the president or the governor or the mayor or the head of our city council, and we did not want to go along with what has always been in place. Imagine how many tanks and how many National Guards people would be unleashed on our city. Imagine how many police officers and riot gear would be summoned if we began processing up and down the street crying out for justice and for mercy. Imagine all that would happen if we rallied together and began to proclaim that we would no longer allow those that were undocumented, those that were living in fear, those that were around us to be subjugated to the abuse and the violence of the government. Imagine what would happen if our sisters would gather together, going up and down the street and saying no means no, that rape and forcible touching is not right. Imagine what would happen if our families would get together and march against our underfunded schools. Imagine what would happen. But the truth is, we don't have to imagine, because we've seen it before. And because we've seen it before, we understand and know that things can change. That's why this morning I'm glad Jesus kept the appointment. Because you see, my brothers and my sisters, if Jesus would not have kept on going in spite of what was going on, if Jesus would have not gone on further in the journey, the voices of the poor and the marginalized would have stopped just at the celebrations. That's why Martin Luther King in 1966 and 67 wrote that book, Where Do We Go From Here? We've seen things change, we've seen things transform, but where do we go from here? We've still got an appointment to keep with our destiny, with the sons and the daughters of sharecroppers and those of former slave masters. We'll live together in harmony because Jesus kept the appointment. No longer do the marginalized not have a voice, but God's given us a voice to carry God's good news to all the world. Jesus kept the appointment with Calvary's cross, that our souls might be delivered from death, hell, and the grave, that we might live and proclaim the good news to those that are suffering. That's why Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to preach good news to those that are poor. God's anointed us because Jesus kept his appointment with death, that he might suffer for you and for me. His appointment with death, that he might hear the cries of his people. His appointment with death, that he might see his nation delivered. And because Jesus kept his appointment, we live early on a Sunday morning. He had another appointment, an appointment with the Spirit of God that raised us from the dead. I'm glad this morning Jesus kept his appointment. Jesus was on time. Jesus was present. Jesus was there. I'm glad Jesus kept his appointment. Jesus kept his appointment that the poor and the struggling could know that their struggles, they were not by themselves. You see, my brothers and my sisters, when we talk about Jesus keeping his appointment, imagine if he would have stopped where he was. Parents, imagine if you would have stopped and never went up there to find out why your child is failing. Imagine if you would not have kept the appointment with the teacher and they would have just used social promotion to get your son or your daughter through. And instead of them going to college, you forced to go visit them on a Sunday afternoon down at Norwich State Penitentiary. Imagine if you wouldn't have kept that appointment with the doctor and you found yourself feeling the aches and pains in your breast and you had not gone. But because you went, they were able to detect it early and get you the proper treatment with your former care that you had. That's why need this family appointment in order for you and for me to have the opportunity and life everlasting. Jesus kept the appointment, which is a divine appointment. That's why it's important to understand when God wakes you up in the morning, that's Jesus keeping an appointment. When God's there in your time of trouble, that's Jesus keeping an appointment. When God is there when you're fearful and afraid, that's Jesus keeping your appointment in order for you to come through. Jesus keeps his appointment. That even when you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Jesus is there. That's why there's goodness and mercy will follow you. That's Jesus keeping his appointment. So this morning, be grateful. Jesus kept his appointment. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. A new appointment is on the horizon. When you call your doctor's office and you feeling sick, they try to squeeze you in. When you go to urgent care, they try to get you in. But there's one that when you call on him, he's always available. His name is Jesus. That's good news. It's good news because he has an appointment with you. That's why we sing some glad morning. When this life is over, I'll fly away. But it's not an appointment with an earthly death. It's an appointment with a spiritual life. One that Jesus promised us because guess what? He kept his appointment. That's why we can walk in the freedom and the newness of life in Jesus Christ our Lord. He knows all about your struggles. He knows all about your issues. He's got an appointment with you. Make sure you keep yours with him. Amen. Some years ago, I had to go to the doctor, and I ended up afraid of canceling my appointment. So the next time I came, you know what the doctor said? You owe me some money. I said, why owe you some money? Because you canceled your appointment. You see, the beauty of it is Jesus never charges you for the cancellation. Because he's already paid the price. In his own blood. But the doctor said to me after I paid him $60, make sure next time you what? Keep your appointment. Amen. On this morning, ask yourself, have you kept your appointment with Jesus? He's waiting on you. He's available for you. Whatever you're going through, know that Jesus is there for you. No matter your struggles, no matter your heartaches, no matter your fears, Jesus is there for you. And we know it because he did it all for us. As we stand all over the church today, there may be somebody here today